We don't want bigots. We don't want people who think that way, because we represent the silent, decent majority of this great country that we live in.
Quiet Riot.
Hello and welcome to Quiet Riot Sunday School, the weekend side order of pious salad to the week's big roast. I'm Alex Andrew.
And I'm Naomi Smith. And while I have zero religious belief, this Sunday school is full of faith in you, our incredible listeners. So on that note, we want to co-create future shows with you.
We are inviting all of our Ko-Fi supporters to join us in a big editorial meeting, a sort of strategy meeting, where we discuss the features that we put in the main show, the guests and bonus episodes that we do, the sort of topics that we cover, what you like, what you don't like, what lengths you prefer, you know, if there's anything that bugs you, how the Ko-Fi site is working for you. Everything will be up for grabs, and we will be sending an email to supporters inviting them to this online video meeting, which will happen on early evening next Thursday, and we'll be sending out that email on Monday. So really today is your very, very last chance to go to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod and support the podcast in order for your email to be on the list when the invitation goes out on Monday.
Exactly. Thanks, Alex. So listeners, if you're signed up by, I'm going to say 8 a.m. on Monday morning, the email will then go to everybody who is a supporter, probably mid-morning Monday, and that will contain the link for Thursday's editorial meeting. So really looking forward to seeing you all there. It's the first of these that we're going to have done. We'll have our cameras on. You'll be able to see us, ask us questions, and Kenny will be keeping us on a strict agenda, I'm sure.
Oh, and by the way, if you have signed up with an old Hotmail that you use to avoid all spam, now is the time to go and put your proper email in. Otherwise, you're not going to get the invitation. And I'm speaking very specifically from personal experience on this.
Quiet Riot. We're midterm of conference season, and don't I bloody know it. So, listeners, we're going to be bringing you readouts from Lib Dems. Look out for a special episode on that early next week. Labour and Tory conferences very soon. But today, Alex and I thought we would do a little focus on the Reform UK conference, or as I like to call it, the Great British Get Out of Our Country Gala. It's not so much bringing you the highlights, but the low points. A very white crowd piled into the NEC in Birmingham earlier this week. And speaker after speaker punched down, whether it was on immigrants or other minority groups. However, there was without question an air of attempting to professionalise. I mean, the scene setting, the staging was all incredibly professional, as you would expect the NEC to put on for a paying guest. But it really felt to me like Farage was learning from the mistakes he's seen from the Trump-Vance campaign, and he does not want Reform UK to be tarnished with the weird brush that blights the GOP at the moment. And when we think back about his former parties, whether that was UKIP or the Brexit Party, they were so littered with oddities, cringe moments. I don't know, Alex, if you remember, there was an activist who was interviewed by Michael Crick for Channel 4 who said, "My buttocks are smooth and my mind is clear. Vote UKIP." Or the very many Farage gaffes we've had, things like, breastfeeding women should sit in the corner. In those days, Farage's parties were all too easy to dismiss as swivel-eyed loons. And I think he really knows it. So he put huge emphasis on the fact that we are going to be vetting candidates. We're going to root out extremists. We're going to be looking and sounding much more normal. That all came through very loud and very clear. And I think we all need to be quite worried about that. This is a party with money, riding high on the fumes of success at the general election, or relative success at the general election. And they're hungry for more. And they know that they need to appear normal and attract ordinary people to be local party chairs and candidates and advocates for the party. So, Alex, despite Farage's best efforts, I feel like that there were still plenty of howlers.
Lee Anderson, for instance,
Yeah,
he goes directly against what you
all
were
of that.
just saying, right? This notion of professionalizing the party, of not being loose cannons, of not saying the wrong thing. I mean, it seems to me they already have a Lee Anderson problem. And a Lee Anderson problem in a party with only 5 MPs, where he's arguably the second most prominent one, is a big problem, right?
This was just after a few supposedly controversial comments I made about Mayor Khan. In my opinion, he has given our capital city away, and he should be thoroughly ashamed of himself. Yeah. I was told at the time that I must apologise to Labour's mayor in London. Yeah. Oh, let me tell you now, conference, I will never apologise to that man.
He cannot help himself but keep
He
on.
cannot help himself, and what we've seen is a pattern of him going too far, being asked to apologise by X party, and then throwing his toys out of the pram and leaving X party and then joining another party, right? So it's difficult to think that the time won't come when there will be a clash between those very big male egos at the centre of that party, right?
And they are all male at the moment.
Yeah. Richard Tice ploughing in all the money while getting none of the spotlight, really, especially considering he has Isabel Oakeshott by his side saying to him, ladylike, you should be king of Cawdor. And then Nigel Farage, who has this overwhelming sense that I know best. And then you have Lee Anderson, who is a recalcitrant blabbermouth and someone who refuses to be reined in and apologize. I find it very difficult to believe that those 3 massive alphas
Can
won't
cohabit
have
for any
a
length of time.
massive bloody battle at some point, right?
Well, of course, they've already purged Ben Habib, who was sacked as, was it vice chair?
Deputy, I think.
Deputy
Yeah.
chair earlier in the year. And he's been out briefing against the party quite stridently over the last couple of days. So the seeds of that discontent between the big male egos is already there. We're seeing big problems being reported within the Labour Party at the moment, at Cabinet, the whole Sue Gray briefings. There's clearly quite a lot of tension there, but that's a party of many hundreds of MPs. It really is quite something when you've only got 5, and there is already quite clear tension between the tonal approach that the party needs to be taking.
Yeah, and the party in control of policy, Labour, they have something to argue about, is what I'm trying to say. The decisions they make right now, Labour, about which direction they go in economically, socially, on the NHS, on education, they are decisions that matter hugely. Reform are largely still arguing about the font. And so to see them already briefing against each other, I think is a different order of magnitude.
When we look across to the Conservative Party leadership race and the pretty awful things that, in particular, Jenrick is saying, that Reform have kind of already won. They're imposing their agenda onto the Conservative Party, and like parrots, the Conservative Party candidates for leadership are copying them.
Let's listen to a little bit of Jenrick's interview on Sky News after he wrote this big opinion piece about English identity.
What do you mean by English identity? Well, look, I'm a proud Brit and a proud unionist, but I'm also proud to be English. And I think it is incredibly important that just as Scottish and Welsh leaders speak up for their distinct national identities, so do English politicians.
I'm going to interrupt you there, sorry. What is English identity?
Well, just as every nation has its own distinct history and culture, so does ours in England.
What is it?
Just as we would know what, a Frenchman would know what France stands for.
What is English identity then, Robert Jenrick?
Well,
what is it?
It's the history and the culture.
If you can't describe what English identity is, how is anybody coming here meant to understand that?
Well, I don't think that you distill the identity and the history of England into a soundbite like you're asking. You, I suspect, are trying to dismiss an English politician speaking about our national identity. And I don't think that you distill it into
English identity.
I don't think you distill it into a soundbite. I think it is something that people across our country know about.
Give me some examples then of what English identity represents.
Well, to me, it is the distinct history of our country. It is the great things that, as a country, England has achieved in the world. It's our values, it's the courtesies and manners that we have as a nation.
Robert Jenrick, the ties that bind us together are fraying. What are the ties that bind us together?
Well, it's exactly what I've just described. It's our history. It's the common culture and values that we have in England.
So I think you're right. They are wearing those clothes. They have clearly decided to move to the right, as we thought they might, because that is historically what parties who have suffered a huge defeat tend to do. It's not what they ought to do, but it always takes them a couple of electoral cycles to wise up to the fact that they need to go towards the centre rather than towards the base. And I had a thought. I was thinking, let's say that Nigel Farage gets it all completely right. Okay? Let's say he manages to professionalise the party. He manages to vet every candidate so that none of the fruitcakes and racists, whatever it was that Cameron called them, make it onto the slate of the party. I mean, doesn't that mean he'll be basically turning them into a clone of the Conservatives?
Well, this is something I've talked about for a long time now, and we can drop a link in the show notes to an article I wrote in The Guardian last year, commenting on the likeness between Nigel Farage's approach and that of a man called Preston Manning, who listeners may well have never heard of. I only have because I'm sort of so obsessed with trying to understand where Farage's politics are taking him. What is his plan? What is the strategy? And Preston Manning was a Farage-esque figure in the 80s in Canada. He was a member of the the established Conservative Party of Canada, and he got fed up with them. He got fed up with them for being insufficiently protectionist and nativist, and he broke off and he set up the Canadian Reform Party. I wonder where Farage got the idea for the name. And he became very successful electorally, putting huge pressure on the established Conservative Party. And ultimately, it did end up in a merger. I've always believed that Farage has looked to Preston Manning for inspiration. And whether it happens in reality, and you do see a sort of formal merger, whether it happens with an informal structure like we've seen UKIP and Brexit Party do in terms of standing down candidates and vice versa, or whether by osmosis, as Jenrick seems to be wanting to do, and other candidates too, but very specifically Jenrick, just merging by adopting all of the policy positions of Reform UK. I worry that the right of the country is becoming even more right-wing.
Yeah.
Riot. We've done a bit of a run through of some of the ghastly figures of the right, but we haven't for a while actually talked about one Professor Matt Goodwin. What's he been up to?
So he was speaking at the Reform Conference. He seems to now be fully absorbed into that outfit, and his speech, I think, gave me more cause for concern than anything else I saw at that conference, because I think he stands in the middle of the reverse proposition to what we were discussing, right?
Okay.
Because we were discussing the idea that, let's say, as in France, Farage will have to move the party away from the fringes in order to make it more palatable to more voters. Matt Goodwin, I think, represents the other possibility, the Alternative für Deutschland possibility, that he will try to make the fringes more acceptable, more palatable to larger swathes of the population. He sort of provides the faux philosophical, faux data-driven ballast to the project, full-throatedly using figures that he knows are wrong. We discussed them last week, those figures from the OBR that the Telegraph took and then extrapolated utter nonsense. And you see Matt Goodwin taking those figures and running with them and going even more extreme direction by projecting that those low-skilled, low-wage migrants, not only will they be that for their entire lives, but they will live to the age of 80.
Low-wage, low-skill migration in the UK, on average, every low-skill, low-wage migrant is costing the British taxpayer £150,000, which rises to £500,000 if they live to the age of 80 and rises to £1 million if they live to the age of 100.
And when we look at the politics of that and the 98 seats that Reform UK are second place in after the 2024 general election, the vast majority, I think it's something like 83 or 84 of those, are seats that Labour won. And Farage did make that pitch in his speech. He did say to people, you know, we've got to go for the Labour Party, and we've seen a lot of attack on Starmer, but obviously from Lee Anderson on Sadiq Khan too. So it's going to be very interesting over the course of the next Parliament to see how all of this plays out, how many right-wing voters they can peel off in Labour seats in order to grow from their 5 MPs to more. And Farage did tell his membership, we're going to win the next general election. So they're obviously being aggressively ambitious in that respect, versus how much they're going to just try and, you know, absorb the Tory party. I think it's a deeply worrying but nonetheless fascinating.
I mean, although I have to say the fact that they're second in so many Labour seats does not necessarily mean that the defence in those seats is entirely up to Labour, right? A lot of their support will be coming from former Tory voters, of which there are thousands, even in those very Labour seats.
Who held their nose and maybe voted Labour this time because they were so appalled at the Tories.
Maybe they were so appalled at the Tories that they voted for reform, and that's why they're second. And maybe if the Tories actually present a better offering to those people, they will switch back to the Conservatives. It is very difficult, I think, to map those movements as a uniform migration of voters,
I
right?
agree.
Different voters go to different parties for different reasons. I think what we can say with some certainty is that the stakes are very, very high for the Labour government in the next 5 years in sorting out some of the underlying issues that drive this kind of sentiment. They do include control of the borders. I think however one feels about immigration, however one feels about our asylum policy, however one feels about the unfortunates who are having to cross the channel in dinghies, the fact of the matter is that even I, as a progressive, want what is happening to be happening as a deliberate result of government policy and action. No one wants what is happening to be as a result of accident.
Or inaction. Yeah.
Or inaction, right? Everyone wants it to be the result of deliberate policy. We want to see a state that works. That, I think, all voters have in common. And so a lot will depend on the extent to which in the next 5 years, Labour can repair the state, repair it to the extent that people begin to see it again as working. If that happens, I think a lot of that support for more extreme sentiments will fizzle out. if that doesn't happen, I think then reform become quite a realistic threat. So, speaking of what Labour's impossible task ahead is, you're off to the Labour conference.
I am. In fact, I need to get off this recording and go and pack because, oh my God, packing for a conference is the worst kind of packing. And I quite like packing. I'm fine when it's for holiday or for a work trip, but for a conference specifically, you have to pack so many annoying things because you're on your feet all day. You've got to have blister plasters. You've got to have comfy shoes. You've got to have smart shoes. You've got to have stuff that will keep you warm when you're in a freezing air-conditioned hangar. And then the sun will come out and boil you. You've got to take your pop-up banners. You've got to take your chargers. You've got to take the things that charge the backup chargers. You've got to take the backup chargers. Like, honestly, it is a freaking nightmare. And you've got to remember
I never go anywhere without my pop-up banners.
Oh, indeed. Right. So, Labour conference. I think if we think back to a couple of weeks ago, they were prepared for a big celebration. Obviously, absolutely landslide election result back in July. First time the party all gets together to celebrate and cheer. And
well, it ain't going to be that.
Well, it ain't going to be that because the thing that I think the speechwriters were probably not anticipating was the furore over his gifts in kind, his hospitality, the issues around the wardrobe, the donations to that, the football tickets, etc. And that story hasn't gone away, doesn't seem to be going away. And it has made lots and lots of the MPs incredibly cross because they've had to, defend it in interviews and they're not even being given a very strong
they've
line.
now said they're not going to take any more
they have, so
basically.
Perhaps that puts it to bed, but
maybe
that's hanging over them, and his speech probably does have to.
Do you know what I found out? And I don't know if you know this. Did you know that ministers don't have to record that stuff, but shadow ministers do? Which is why it always seems a huge amount, especially in pre-election campaign, where basically you go to whatever you're invited. You want to schmooze with as many people as possible.
Yeah.
So whatever football team offers you a box, whatever business thing offers you an away day,
concerts,
everything you want to be seen as much as possible.
Yeah.
Now, if you are Home Office Secretary, you don't have to declare that stuff as hospitality. If you are Shadow Home Office Secretary, you do. And that is why when the bill comes in from a campaign period, it's always the shadow team that appears to have accepted hundreds of thousands worth of hospitality while the government took
and a
nothing.
Good impartial journalist ought to know that and write it up accordingly. Anyway, that is a whole other episode of the podcast. Policy stuff, I think, to look out for is clearly going to be how they're going to handle Israel-Palestine. That has already sparked protests and debates, and there's talks about demonstrations outside the conference expressing frustration with the party's current reluctance to openly condemn Israel's actions. There's going to be plenty on that. I think there'll be potentially some other flashpoints around austerity and public sector cuts and potentially clean energy too, because of the unions wanting to dial down some of that stuff or push further in other directions. So I think the usual drumbeat of activist and union reaction to some of it will be there. What else to look out for? I mean, I think what's interesting is just how high security it's going to be. We're getting many more emails than usual about, what you can and can't bring in, don't get caught out and not be allowed in. Now, if you're an exhibitor and you're putting up things in your exhibition space, it's really handy to have ropes and string and scissors and knives to cut open the boxes of reports that you've had. And none of that can go in. So I think just some of the management of the sheer volume of people coming in and out might slow things down a bit. So, there may be reports of kind of a bit of administrative headache. And I just sort of sense that the mood isn't going to be as jubilant as one would expect it to be, given that it's the first big jamboree post a landslide election. So, I'm looking forward to it. Liverpool is such an amazing city. I absolutely love Liverpool. My favourite city in that part of the world, bar none. sorry, Manchester, but it really is superb. So I'm going to be recording dispatches from the conference and sending those in to listeners so they can get a bit of a flavour of what's going on. I'm slightly daunted by the sheer volume of people that are going to be there and whether we're actually going to manage
we'll
to
be
things.
slotting them into our main episode, which for next week only we're recording and putting out a day later, precisely to allow you to get back from conference.
Indeed.
And so we can have a great big chat about that.
Yeah.
And we should also talk a little bit about the BBC investigation into sexual abuse by Mohammed Al-Fayed, because I think that was a huge story at the tail end of this week. Mohammed Al-Fayed is the late Egyptian tycoon who owned Harrods, among many other businesses, the Ritz in Paris, etc. And some horrific allegations have come forward with strong evidence behind them. The BBC investigation seemed to be happening in tandem with a legal case that was launched the day after it aired. It was a large press conference, legal team representing 37 women. They think the victims might be actually in the hundreds, who say they were either sexually assaulted or raped by Al-Fayed. Several of them were there and spoke publicly and movingly. Now, Al-Fayed is dead, of course, but what is interesting is that this case is going after Harrods, the business, alleging
Which
that
he sold, 14 years ago more? Yeah.
some time ago, alleging that it not only facilitated this abuse, but it covered it up. The new owners of Harrods say they're utterly appalled, condemn his actions in the strongest terms, but it will still be a very, very interesting case, I think, to watch. On the wider point, Naomi,
Yeah.
what does the constant surfacing of this sort of horrific, systematic sexual abuse tell us about organizations and the way they treat these issues?
Well, I mean, it's so depressing, Alex, that, there's yet another one and there will be more. And when we look back over, the scandals of recent years, whether that's been those coming out of the Catholic Church, out of the monarchy, out of Parliament, out of the BBC itself, who, were embroiled in the Hugh Edwards story not a day before this Mohammed Al-Fayed story gets broken by them. And obviously historically has had issues with Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris, etc. It's, to me, it is about the corrupting influence of power, and very specifically within hierarchical organizations. That is the thing that each of these institutions has in common. Hollywood too, let's not forget issues like Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein is a very powerful figure in the world of business too. And when you have concentrations of power in hierarchical organizations, the culture is what rots because people are too afraid to speak truth to power. They have so little agency. The control that these men, and it's not always men, but at the times that it's women, is to be almost statistically insignificant, means that people who know what's going on, and we've heard it time and time again, so everyone knew the rumours and nobody did anything about it. Oh yeah, he was handsy, we all knew it, we all got told to keep away from that MP, that radio presenter, that casting director, and yet, while everyone knew, no one said anything, no one did anything. And why not? And they didn't because they couldn't, because to do it would be putting themselves at financial risk, potentially ruin, because their jobs and their livelihoods were at stake. And how do you even begin to fix it? Well, you have to just try and lead by example in the kinds of organizations where you can enforce change. And the public sector and Parliament are obvious examples of that. We have to disperse power. And, as a liberal, for me, that's what it fundamentally comes down to. If you concentrate power in the hands of a few people, it will be corrupting.
What about, we're just talking about the Labour conference, okay? What about party conference season? Don't boozy events like that just become hotbeds for this kind of...
Yeah, totally. My parents
is there enough done on safeguarding?
When I first went to a party conference, I was about 23, and my parents had just stopped going to them around that time. They'd had their fill of sort of 30 years plus of going, and they were very worried for me. And, they did say, their meat markets, be careful, drinking too late, make sure you've got somebody to walk back to your hotel with who you trust. And it does happen. It happened at the Liberal Democrat conference last week. A 57-year-old man from Bristol, a member and an activist, has been arrested, I believe. Of course it happens, and it happens every time. And you see people getting far too drunk, and you see predatory people eyeing up the vulnerable and the drunk and the young. And they can and often are people who will use their power to seduce and will say, oh, you want a promotion, you want a job, you want a meeting with this minister, etc., etc. And, that's how these things happen. And again, it all comes back to power abuses. A lot has improved. There are now safe spaces designated at most of the conferences. There are, very strict rules and codes of conduct, and action does tend to get taken much more swiftly now. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are finding themselves in horrendous situations and not speaking up about it for fear of the impact that it will have on their career.
Probably not something that weirdly Reform UK has to worry about, to be honest. I was watching a sort of live report from GB News on it on the day it was on. And as the crowd was streaming behind the reporter who was there, I don't think I saw a single woman. Is there a danger, you think, that we construct a sort of narrative in which every man was a sexual predator of some sort or a paedophile of some sort back then, and moral responsibility becomes diffuse because that's just how it was, and we also stop paying attention at sexual violence still going on because we consider it a back then problem.
Exactly. Oh, in those days you had to put up with having your bum slapped in the office and whatever, and it's not true. And you and I talked about this. Both of us had fathers of similar ages, born in the 30s, came to positions of influence and power in their organizations in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and they were really alert to it, and they would tell us about it. And I vividly remember my father saying, I tell all of my colleagues and direct reports, don't interview somebody on your own, always have a colleague. It's wrong, and they knew it was wrong then. I think we know, though, because they were all trying to cover it up. They all know it's wrong. It wasn't that it was legal and accepted. It was that it was still taboo then. It's just...
Yeah. I don't remember a time when the older male figures in my family weren't actually quite conservative in that way, small c. There was never any doubt that these things are not okay.
Yeah.
And the way you hear that period
gives all like Mad Men.
It sort of gives the impression that it was permitted and everyone was at it. And it's just not true. There was a lot of it going on, and there still is a lot of it going on.
Yep.
But it has to do, it seems to me, with power. Because what these big male figures have in common, that these stories keep surfacing about, central to sexual conduct is an understanding of consent. And it's not a coincidence in my mind that these are men that are used to never being told no in any aspect of their lives.
Yep. And over in the United States, we have a candidate running for president again who said those women, what was it, they let you grab their pussies, or whatever awful phrase he used. No, they didn't. They had no frickin' choice because they were terrified of you.
Yeah.
You're dead right. It's all about power. It's all about men that haven't been told no enough, and it's incumbent upon us all to be alert to it still, call it out, and do what we can to push for the decentralization of power in all hierarchical organizations. Quiet Riot. I mentioned the US election there, Alex. Sorry to trigger you. We're not going to talk too much about the kind of Harris-Trump element of things, but instead, I wanted to ask you about the quite extraordinary story coming out of North Carolina.
Oh, God, the Mark Robinson stuff.
That's right, yeah. So listeners who don't know, Mark Robinson, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee for governor, has posted some really quite extraordinary, explicit and racist comments on, or allegedly, I should say, on a pornographic website many, many years ago, about 10 years ago. And CNN have been investigating this and they've released it. He has denied it and said it's all nonsense. What did he actually say, or how did he kind of refer to himself?
It really is quite extraordinary. This was on a porn site called the Nude Africa Forum. He allegedly suggested we should bring slavery back, that he would buy a few slaves. He identified himself as a black Nazi.
Wow.
It's some really extra, like he would take Hitler over Democrats, that he's not allowed in the KKK, but if the Ku Klux Klan let blacks in, he'd join, and called Martin Luther King Martin Lucifer. I'm not even going to say the last word. It's quite extraordinary stuff. This is someone who is already a very controversial person. Like, you can look him up if you want to
He
find.
sounds mentally unwell.
I'm sure there's a complicated psychological explanation for all of it, but
So, I mean, how has Trump reacted? And as I understand it, they're pretty sort of close associates, aren't they?
So this is a big problem, not because they might lose their governorship, which is now swinging against him, but because North Carolina is an extraordinarily important state for Trump to win in the presidential election.
Yeah.
And because of the way the electoral college maths work, it's more important to Trump than it is to Harris.
To Kamala Harris,
right?
yes.
She has various routes to 270, which is the number of electoral college votes that she needs. But he's really, if it doesn't go through North Carolina, it's very difficult. And it's a state that was leaning towards him and has now gone back to being very much in play. He only won North Carolina by 75,000 votes in 2000. And, he's associated himself very closely with this controversial candidate. He did a rally in North Carolina on Saturday. Not ideal timing. That was something that had been planned. And
how did that go down?
He was uninvited from the rally and wasn't even mentioned in any way, shape, or form before, during, or after it. They're stuck with this guy and he's dragging the ticket down. The question is, to what extent will he have an effect on the Trump race? Because I'm sure there are a lot of people that will say, I'm not going to vote for him, but Trump is fine. There was an extraordinary report on the BBC website that I need to read you a small extract from. This was during a regular meeting of the Johnston County Republican Women's Committee. They heard the news live while this was going on. It barely caused a stir, apparently. One of them said, if the accusations are accurate, it's something for him and his wife to deal with. It's not my business.
Right.
And then soon afterwards, the group discussed their planned $200 donation to his campaign. And the statement came out, what we decided is that we're going to donate even more money to Mr. Robinson.
Oh, my God. Sorry. Is the Johnston County Republican Women's Committee mostly white?
Genuinely, I could not tell you, but that would be my suspicion, right? We weren't too sure about him, but now that we know he's as much of a racist as we are, we've doubled our donation. So all this stuff is swirling around, and I guess the less direct but no less important effect is that it completely knocked the second assassination attempt on Trump, completely knocked it out of the headlines, because that was beginning to benefit him. Maybe not in the national race, but in his personal ratings. I guess people felt a pang of sympathy, and now that's again swinging the opposite way. So it's a local story that could end up having a massive national impact, because if Trump ends up losing North Carolina,
The route to victory
his
is
route
not
to victory is really difficult, really difficult.
I mean, I hope so. My fear is it's the economy stupid, and I'm hearing many, many, many reports of voters that really don't like Vance. They don't like a lot of the stuff Trump says these days. They are definitely with Kamala Harris when it comes to policy issues like reproductive rights, but they say I was better off during 2016 to 2020 than I am now. So I'm going to forgive all of those things because I just want to feel more comfortable in my own pocket.
Harris is climbing and closing that gap to really very fine degrees when it comes to the economy. Like, who do you think would manage the economy better? She's rising up and really almost level with Trump now. So that might be less of an issue. My fear, as you know, is that in the privacy of the polling booth, there are a lot of men that won't be able to bring themselves to vote for a woman to be president. I hope I'm wrong. I have been wrong before, because this is precisely how I felt before Obama's first victory. In a dark corner of my heart, I thought they will just never vote for a black president. And they proved me wrong, and how? In large, large numbers.
Yeah.
So I hope that America is ready to really smash this particular ceiling as well and prove me wrong.
Quiet Riot. And that is it for this week's Quiet Riot Sunday School.
Remember, you can follow us on social media, including Blue Sky at Quiet Riot Pod, or email us on quietriotpod@gmail.com. And we do reply to you. I'm always delighted by how surprised people are when we reply to you. And don't forget, our editorial meeting for supporters is on Thursday evening, so sign up before 8 a.m. Monday morning if you want to join us, because after that we may not see your email address register.
And I'm now definitely off to pack for Labour Party conference. And yeah, keep your ears peeled for dispatches from Liverpool. Thanks for listening. And remember, we'll be a day late with the main show this week.
But we do have some little bonus episodes for you in the in-between time, including one with Arthur Snell on the situation in Lebanon. And before that, a very, very good interview between Naomi and a Liberal Democrat MP about their conference that just happened. So look out for those early next week. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Love you lots, and we'll speak soon.
Bye.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Did you know that the UK has invented 51% of all the inventions in the world over the past 1,000 years? Incredible.